Hello, I'm Wayne from TorqueCars. So we're going to look at stage 3 mods. Now when we talk about stage 3 mods, we're talking about motorsport mods. We're talking about mods that are not road legal in most areas. It really is the way of extracting the maximum performance from your engine, but a lot of these mods are just not even practical for road use, even if they are legal. Let's discuss some of the best stage 3 mods, and look out for the last one because it really does make significant power gains and really dramatically alters the way that your engine works and the performance you get from it. By going to stage 3, you can actually avoid a lot of the drawbacks that come with the other stages because you're not constrained by keeping the car legal, and you're not constrained by making a car that's comfortable to drive on your daily commute and will cope with everyday problems and potholes and degraded maintenance. So stage 3 tuning, this is where we get to take our car to the absolute max, and we really start to push everything so we can get the maximum benefit from all of the mods that we do. We're not constrained by conforming to emissions regulations, and we can really go to the absolute limits of power and performance on our car and really extract everything we can. So stay tuned to the end, because if you do this switch you can make substantially more power. So we've got 10 mods that we would class as stage 3 mods. And the first of these is a lighter flywheel. We've mentioned it, but with motorsports you can go a lot lighter with the flywheel. You're not keeping the car economical. You're not looking to make the car run on hills and valleys and over long distances. You really do want the RPMs to raise and fall as quickly as possible. And the best way of doing that on most cars is with a very light flywheel. The added benefit of this is it's also cutting out weight from the engine. So you get a double benefit from it. Not only does the engine rev more freely and more quickly, you also end up with a lighter car. So for stage 3 mods, you start to think about track work and track driving. Now most tracks are very well maintained, they're quite flat, they've got banked corners, and they're quite forgiving as far as suspension goes. So with a track setup, you can actually drop the car to the maximum that you can get away with fairly stiff springs, so there's not necessarily a great deal of travel. There's a bit of fine tuning required. You don't want the car wheels to be skipping over every lump and bump. You no longer have to set the suspension up to give you a comfortable ride over the frankly shocking road surfaces that we have to drive over. So just by dropping the car, firming up the suspension, you can dramatically alter the handling. And with stage 3 you can actually go to extremes that were just not possible with stage 2 or stage 1 because the car's not being used on the road. So when it comes to braking mods, again, you're using the car in the track environment, so you will be using the brakes much more often and the brakes will be running much hotter. So this moves completely away from a standard setup which typically requires your brake to operate from cold temperatures and to give you effective stopping. In fact, if you used standard road brakes on some heavy track work, you will get brake fade and all sorts of other problems. I've seen brakes catch fire and start smoking because they've just been destroyed by the heat generated in the motorsport environment. So getting race spec brakes is a great stage 3 mod. They're usually much noisier than road brakes, so you wouldn't be able to live with them on a daily basis, and they're really not effective at cold temperatures, but they can cope with the heat that you generate in your heavy driving on the track. And it's the best way of improving the braking ability of your car. If you want to keep braking into corners aggressively without suffering from brake fade or even brake failure, then race spec pads are certainly the way to go. Now, like road pads, you can get different grades of race spec pads, so you can tailor it to a certain extent as to your requirements, the track work you're doing. Personally, if I was going on a track day, I would fit a new set of race spec pads to my car. It's surprising how much wear and tear goes on to your brake pads during a track day, and it's worth just checking the discs are still in good order as well before and after your track day. You're asking them to do a lot more work. And fluid changes also make sense. If you use a DOT 5.1 brake fluid, it's more suited to track work. It's better at operating at higher temperatures, whereas standard brake fluid often degrades over time, moisture collects in it, you get air bubbles forming, and the dramatic temperature changes will cause it to degrade. So test your brake fluid regularly anyway, whether you're doing track work or not. So exhaust mods have always been quite popular with all of the other stages and intake mods. Now with stage 3 we're looking at motorsports, so we no longer have to comply to construction and use requirements to suit local government legislation. It's worth mentioning at this point as well that a lot of tracks have noise limits, so if your car exceeds their decibel limits for exhausts, you won't be allowed to do your track day. So you will still need a silencer, muffler, and you need to control the noise that comes out. But noise does not equal power. I have to say that time and time again. A lot of people think if a car is making more noise, it's making more power. That is not the case. The flow rate is what you should look at. So removing the catalysts and diesel particulate filters, for example, will increase the flow rate through the exhaust and help you to make more power. So fitting a sports catalyst is actually quite similar to removing the cat altogether. The differences in power is minimal, but again at stage 3 you want to be extracting the maximum power that you can from every part of the engine, and the cat is often a restriction that you want to get around. So with stage 3 mods as well, you'd probably start to look at doing internal engine work. So you're making a lot more power, you're really pushing all of the components much harder than you have done before. So fitting forged pistons, forged crank, and making sure that all of these components are balanced will really help you to extract as much power as possible without worrying about reliability. Now, if you do motorsport mods on a standard engine, it's going to break, it just won't be able to cope with all of the added stresses that it's under. So by switching to forged components, stronger parts, and making sure the engine's balanced, you've raised the tolerances for reliability to a much higher level, and that allows you to go to the next level really in your tuning project. When the engine is balanced properly, you can extend the RPM range, you can exploit the power that you've got in the top end, and that's probably one of the main aims we have with motorsports tuning and race tuning, getting the power at the top end of the RPM range where you'll be exploiting it a lot more than you ever would if you were just doing your daily commute or driving your car in everyday traffic. So another internal mod that we'd recommend taking to stage 3 is a very aggressive cam profile, a competition cam. We don't recommend those for everyday use because it affects the tick over and the idling of the car and can make it really hard to live with. But in motorsports you're not constrained by that. You won't be using the low end of the RPM range. Your car will generally be in the middle to the top third of RPMs most of the time. So that's why you want the power. So tailoring all of these mods to make sure you've got enough power at that top end is certainly going to be beneficial to your project. So we should also mention tyres. Now with race tyres and motorsport tyres you may well just be thinking slicks, and to a certain extent you'd be right. On a dry track you dramatically increase the grip by going to slick tyres, and they're certainly not legal on roads, and with the wet conditions and poor road surfaces you wouldn't want to be driving around with slick tyres everywhere. So getting race spec tyres also generally means the compound that they use to construct the tyre is softer to give you more grip, so they will wear more quickly, but as a result they give you better grip. Wet weather race tyres or tyres with a tread pattern, they will give you a much better grip characteristic, better cornering feel, and overall they really improve the performance of your car. When you start comparing track times on modern cars, you'll see a lot of modern hatches are turning in times that were there with the early supercars from the 80s and 90s, and most of that is, in my opinion, down to the quality of tyres and the leaps and bounds that they've made in tyre technology over the years. You can now expect your hot hatch to corner as well as one of those early supercars. So we are living in a great age, especially when it comes to tuning your car and setting it up for the track. If you want to know more about tyres, we've got other videos on that, and visit our site as well. There's a lot more information that we can go into about choosing the right tyre for your intended use of the car. And now we're in the realms of motorsports, your considerations are completely different to what they were when you were considering your car being set up for just road use. So turbo upgrades are another great way of adding power. We've discussed those in the previous stages, but with stage 3 you just want the maximum power you can get, so we generally start to look at very big turbos. Now they come with the drawback of having lag at low RPMs, but we're not using the low RPMs. The use of the car is going to be, as we've just said, in the upper middle to third of the RPM range, and often up to the top. So that's where you want the power to be. So by getting a large turbocharger, you can really push the power in that band that you're going to be using the most. And we've seen gains of 100 to 150% or more depending on the other mods that you've done to the car. But the turbocharger is a fantastic way of adding substantial amounts of power to your car and putting that power exactly where you want it to be. So reducing the weight of the car is another great way of effectively increasing performance. So in a race car, you'll notice they don't have lots of comfortable seats and all the gadgets in the dashboard. You've got the bare minimum. You've generally got a few more gauges because it's important to know other things that are going on in the engine other than just the RPM and the engine temperature. But other than that, everything else has been removed. The additional seats, you may well have a roll cage that's been added to the car, which will add weight but increase the structural rigidity of the car, and most tracks will actually insist on some measure of safety precautions, including roll cages, harnesses and some kind of fire extinguisher system fitted to the car. So check your local track regulations as well. But getting rid of weight, it allows the car to accelerate more quickly. It improves the cornering, particularly if you've got quite a heavy car to start with. So you can replace body panels with lighter versions. Carbon fibre has been used, there's other materials as well. Even fiberglass in some cases is lighter than the metals that the manufacturers use in their cars. So just by swapping the bonnet and maybe the wings, you can make quite dramatic weight saving reductions. You can go to extreme levels. We've got a member in our forum, he's drilled holes in the chassis. He knows what he's doing, don't worry, he's not just drilled holes willy-nilly like a plague of woodworm that have gone in there. In non-structural locations, any excess weight has been removed from the actual frame of the car and the chassis, and he really is running the car as light as possible. And it becomes a science. You start to obsess over every single gram and choose the lightest bolts you can. The glass in windows can actually present a hazard in motorsports, so most tracks will actually ask for them to be removed, and you may well replace them with a plastic alternative. So plastics such as Lexan and plexiglass have often been discussed. Some are not suitable for car use, so don't just go out there and buy some perspex. It needs to be fireproof, it needs to have certain levels of shatter protection as well, and you don't want something that's going to flex and bend too much, so it needs to be fairly rigid. So do your research. We've got an article on our site on weight reduction, and that throws in some tips there on the types of alternatives to glass that can be used to make those dramatic weight savings in the car. And stripping out the controls for the windows, you won't generally need those. Most people get away with just having a little vent that's either open or closed in motorsport. You're certainly not in the car for comfort, you're there to get the best times you can. So providing the driver can cope with the harsh conditions, you're fine. If the car's getting too hot, for example, you may well need to add some kind of external vent to allow fresh air to come in and keep the driver conscious. So fuel upgrades are another important aspect to your tuning project. Now, you want the car to burn more air, and to do that it needs more fuel. You've got to match the air and fuel in the same ratios. So fuel upgrades would involve fitting higher capacity fuel injectors, and in most cases of stage 3 tuning you would also need to uprate the fuel pump, the fuel pressure regulator and other components in the systems, even including the fuel lines. If they're operating under much higher pressures than they were originally, you certainly don't want them to split or fail. So it makes perfect sense to just look at the whole fuel system, upgrade that, but don't just give the 20% that we normally recommend for road tuned cars. If you push the boundaries much more than that, you'll be able to extract more power from your car when you start adding other mods, and you'll have a lot more leeway there to play with on the track. Also, on some cars we've noticed that when they're cornering on the track, they're cornering so hard that the fuel pickup in the fuel pump is running dry. It's not getting fuel, and they're getting flat spots just through the inertia caused through cornering. So having a different design fuel pump and fuel pickup can really pay dividends in those situations. Now, if you're on a forums or you're a member of a forum or a club, you probably know about the drawbacks and pitfalls of some of the car models out there, and these have been addressed in the aftermarket. So just by doing your research, you can address problems that the manufacturers have built into the cars inadvertently, because they're not expecting the terrific cornering forces that we're now giving the car to cope with in our track use and race use of the car. So now we come to the mod that we recommend doing after all the other mods, and it's just a simple switch. I say a simple switch, there's actually quite a bit involved, but when you start looking at the fuels, if you restrict yourself to running pump grade gas, you're limiting the performance of your car quite dramatically. For example, switching to nitromethane, you can actually see an increase in power of 240%. Yes, 2.4 times the power you would get just by switching fuel. You obviously need a lot more fuel to get those power levels. So let's just discuss about the BTUs and the air to fuel ratios that these fuels need to be mixed in to get the maximum benefits. We'll see why race fuels can make such a dramatic difference to your car. The air fuel mix for gasoline is round about 14.7 to 1 in order to get that good clean ignition and burn. If we move to ethanol, we find that the BTUs in ethanol is 9,750 per pound, and the air to fuel ratio is 9 to 1. So it's a lower air to fuel ratio. If we went to methanol, it's slightly less than ethanol at 9,500 BTUs per pound. The air fuel ratio for that is 6 to 1. Then we come to the big daddy, the one that everyone's talking about, the ultimate race fuel, nitromethane. The energy rating of nitromethane is 5,000 BTUs per pound, but the ratios it should be mixed in is just 1.7 to 1. So nitromethane is actually very explosive. It should be handled with extreme caution, and lots of adjustments need to be made to the car in order to use it effectively and safely. As it burns, it releases nitric acid vapor, which is really nasty stuff. So all of those in the pit crew and those working on the engine need to have some kind of protection against those fumes that the engine is creating. So the key benefit of using these race fuels or higher spec fuels that actually contain less energy is the fact that you can use more fuel to the air that you're getting into the engine, and that is where you add the power. But as far as a lot of these specialist race fuels go, you need to make extensive adjustments to the ECU, to the timing. It needs to change that trim, the spark advance, in order to get a clean burn. You're completely changing the parameters it has to work with, and if you want to use these fuels, you're probably doing it in a motorsport environment or looking at track days. So it really does make sense to get the car set up. So other fuel options that we've seen used on motorsport cars and stage 3 cars is nitrous oxide. They call it giggle gas. It's used medically. It's not the same thing, so don't start sniffing the motorsport one. The medical grade is quite a different substance, and it's designed not to be harmful. Whereas the motorsport, they don't worry about safety in terms of breathing it in. You certainly wouldn't be breathing it in recreationally. But nitrous oxide is interesting. As it burns, it releases nitrogen and oxygen. So oxygen is something your engine needs to burn fuel. So a great way of adding more oxygen is just to fit nitrous. Now, the downside is the nitrous tank only holds a finite amount of fuel, and it's only really suitable for short bursts of extra power, and generally at wide open throttle. It's not something that will increase the power throughout the RPM range. A lot depends on how the car is set up. But think carefully about your car, how you're going to be using it, and you really can push the boundaries as far as you like when it comes to motorsports mods, because you're not constrained by keeping the car legal. You just want the car to give you the best lap times you can, and hopefully to avoid breaking down. Now, with any tuning mods, you're removing the margin of error where the car becomes more likely to break down. So you do still need to bear in mind this safety margin. You don't want to do everything to the absolute max. If your engine's certified for an 8,000 RPM redline, it would be foolish to use it at 8,000 RPMs all the time. You've got to build in a little bit of leeway if you want the reliability, because when you're on a track, breaking down is one of the most embarrassing and frustrating things, especially if you've paid for your track time and you just can't use your car because something on the car has broken. Care of a stage 3 car is quite different to conventional maintenance, so you would generally take your car in once a year for its annual service. Manufacturers specify about 9,000 miles, don't they, or 12,000 miles depending on the engine. With motorsports, everything is working so much harder, and you've narrowed that margin of safety down, so it makes a lot of sense to get the car serviced more regularly. In fact, a lot of motorsport cars are stripped down after every race or after every other race, or spare engines are kept and the engines are frequently swapped out, so the older engines can be rebuilt with newer components. As they wear, you start to go well outside of those tight manufacturing tolerances and you start to lose performance. So keeping a car in top condition is actually a lot more expensive and a lot more time consuming when you have a stage 3 car. So hopefully this video has shown you the benefits of stage 3 mods. If you want to take your car on the track and use your car as a race car, you've got a whole new spectrum of mods that you can apply to your car to do that and to achieve that. But hopefully we've also flagged up some of the downsides of these mods, so that would stop them from being recommended and suitable as road mods and everyday mods on your road car. So don't forget to stay tuned. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe and be sure to like this video because it really helps us to get out there, and we'll see you in the next video.